Yes, thank you very much for that introduction and for inviting me to speak on this topic. I'm going to start with a caveat. I'm not really a horsey person. I'm more of a dog person. I was a horsey teenager, but I wouldn't describe myself as a horsey adult. So I do, however, seem to spend a lot of time working to try to improve the welfare of horses, albeit ranging from wild horses, recreational horses, and particularly in recent years, race horses. But I wouldn't describe myself as a horse expert. So what I'm talking about today comes from several decades of trying to understand society's treatment of animals and advocate for improvements. And in this case, I'm talking about horses. So to help navigate our journey along the lifetime of a horse, I've chosen to focus on 6 areas. I'm going to talk about our attitudes to horses, the importance of evidence versus experience, animal welfare standards, traceability, end-of-life options, and finally, some simple ways to help assess welfare and how we might determine whether horses have a good life. Before we start to look at attitudes, let's establish what we mean by a good life for all horses. This is my rather simplistic diagram to try and illustrate the main life stages of an owned horse. So obviously every horse has a different life journey, but it's really important to consider that everything that happens to them in each of these key stages will affect whether they experience a good life. To examine this, our starting point always has to be the experience of the individual horse and what can be done to minimise their negative experiences and maximise their positive experiences. How to do this when the range of these experiences are so broad and can change so much over the course of a horse's life and are influenced by so many different factors is a huge challenge. I've borrowed this diagram from the Zoo and Aquarium Association to help us visualise the experience or the affective or mental state of an animal over time and whether this is positive or negative. So what the wiggly line here shows is what, for example, a young horse might experience over the course of a day. We need then to use our imaginations to think about this over the course of a horse's entire lifetime, which could be 25 years or even more. Unlike many companion animals, horses may have many different owners and experience multiple trainers, handlers, and riders over the course of their active lives. They often also have to cope with many different challenges, different situations, different interventions, and a huge variety of training demands, as well as interference from veterinarians, farriers, and others. Any one of these interactions can have a profound and continuing impact on a horse's mental or affective state. So ensuring that the early experiences of horses are positive, where the presence of humans is associated with feelings of safety and enjoyment, can really set the foundation for a good life. So attitudes. We know that there are strong links between human attitudes towards animals and their subsequent behaviour towards those animals. The way we see an animal, our relationship towards them, affects our attitude, our expectation, and our treatment. The thing about horses is they're often considered somewhere between livestock and a companion animal. So this pie chart is from a poll last year of a representative sample of Australians, which posed the statement, a horse is not the same as other livestock, like sheep or cattle. Just over half of the respondents agreed with that statement, and less than a quarter disagreed with it. So it seems as though most Australians are more comfortable with seeing horses as companion animals than livestock. But you're more likely to hold that perception if you're not involved in the racing industry. In focus groups conducted in the same survey with 2 groups of people, those involved or uninvolved in racing, people were more likely to consider horses as livestock if they were involved in racing. And those who viewed horses as livestock were less likely to think that racehorses were owed a good retirement. There are hopeful signs, however, that some participants in the racing industry are moving away from a view of horses as a commodity towards accepting that they do have a responsibility to care for horses through their racing and post-racing lives. So in terms of attitudes, things are looking as though they're heading in the right direction for a better life for horses. What about knowledge? Do we know enough about what horses need to enable them to live a good life? We know that domestic horses retain many of the characteristics of their wild ancestors, something made obvious when they return to a wild state, like these horses in Australia's snowy mountains. Wild horses roam over large territories in social groups and spend the vast majority of their time foraging. As a prey species, the flight response is critical to their survival. It's the characteristics of being a social prey animal that made horses so adaptable to domestication and to human control. But with domestication comes compromise and a potential conflict of interest between humans and horses. There is, of course, a vast amount of experience and accumulated knowledge about the care and management of horses. But this doesn't necessarily match up with the scientific evidence about what is a good life for horses. We know that despite the accumulation of experience, poor management is still a significant factor affecting horse welfare. And often this is based on a misunderstanding of the needs of horses and a mismatch between tradition and evidence. So we need to bridge the gap that exists between that accumulating scientific knowledge about equine welfare and the practical application of these findings by the people who own, train and care for horses. So for example, this horse, it's housed at great expense in a stable in the middle of Sydney. This couldn't be further from a horse's natural state, the environment this horse is in. But many people still believe that stabling horses for 24 hours a day, restricting forage and imposing social isolation is an acceptable way to treat a horse because it's the way it's been done for so long. Perhaps it's not surprising that there's a gap in understanding between the lay horse owner, animal welfare science, and equitation science, and that's the scientific study of horse-rider interactions, given the recency of these disciplines. Compare this to the tens of thousands of years since horses were domesticated, and it's no wonder that we have a long way to go. So it's also not that long ago that our focus in animal welfare was completely on avoiding suffering, and only recently that we started to consider, let alone assess, positive experiences and the concept of a good life. I'd say that in many animal industries in Australia, there's still a deep level of resistance to move beyond a biological functioning approach to animal welfare and to embrace the 5 domains and the concept of positive welfare. But it's high time we did that. One of the problems with addressing the knowledge gap between experience and evidence is that most horse owners are completely unaware of it. A great example is this insightful study that was published earlier this year on equestrians' perceptions of horse happiness. So it was a relatively small sample, just over 300 people contacted through social media about horses. But the results show a supreme level of confidence from respondents on their ability to read their horses' minds. So 94% of participants in the survey answered yes to the question, do you know if your horse is happy? And 93% believed that their own horse was very happy or somewhat happy. Only 4.5% of respondents were cautious enough to say that they didn't know. This overconfidence in understanding horse welfare is not a phenomenon that's exclusive to equestrians. I'm sure many of you will already have heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect. So this is a type of cognitive bias that causes people to overestimate their knowledge or ability, particularly in areas with which they have little to no experience. You can think of a cognitive bias in this case like a blind spot. It stops you from seeing what you don't know. As you acquire knowledge about a topic, and I think I felt I went on this curve preparing for this talk, you start to realise how little you actually know about something, and then eventually figure out maybe it makes sense, but the topic's much more complicated than you initially thought. Because going back to that survey, it really is an audacious claim for 94% of people to claim that they know when another animal is happy. Okay, let's move on to standards. One of the major impediments to a good life for all horses is the difficulty in moving the bar in terms of what's regarded as an acceptable or reasonable way to treat a horse. Legal decisions rely on precedents to decide on issues of animal cruelty. And in the horse world, there are countless established practices which we know have negative impacts on horses, yet they're still considered acceptable and reasonable in a legal sense. In Australia, after dogs and cats, horses are the most common subject of complaints about cruelty or neglect of animals, but prosecutions are rare. And that's likely because there's a lack of mandatory minimum standards for horses in Australia. So that means that enforcement actions rely on general cruelty clauses rather than horse-specific provisions. It's much more risky to take on a prosecution in these circumstances, which means that most legal challenges hinge on extreme cases of cruelty, such as this horse seized from a Queensland property by RSPCA inspectors in 2019. Let's look at one example of this issue around what's acceptable and see where current standards sit in both Australia and New Zealand. Castration is one of the most common surgical procedures performed on horses. But despite being so commonly performed, complications are reported in up to 30% of cases, even when castration is performed by a vet. Now, I'm expecting if I asked you all if you thought castration was a painful procedure, most of you would say yes, particularly possibly the men in the audience. That's what a group of experts also agreed when they considered 5 different castration interventions and their negative impact on animal welfare in terms of the 5 domains. So just to explain these box and whisker charts for you, so the arrow on the left indicates the severity of negative impact increasing from left to right. Looking at how close the top 4 black dots are to the right of each box, it's clear that non-veterinary castration, that is, carried out by a lay person without any pain relief, was considered to have the worst negative impact with the least variation in individual scores. But even when castration is carried out by a vet with both anaesthesia and analgesia, it was also considered to have a significant adverse impact. So it's a significant intervention for a horse to experience. So how does this compare with what's considered acceptable in New Zealand and Australia? In New Zealand, where you do have a code of welfare for horses, castration is only permitted to be carried out by a vet using local or general anaesthetic. There's no legal requirement for both. In Australia, in most states, there's no specific regulation that prevents lay people from performing castrations and no national standards for horse welfare. So it's only in Victoria that there are minimum enforceable standards for horses, and that's the only Australian state. And these specify that castration can only be performed by a vet, but there's still a judgment call that can be made by the vet in terms of pain relief. If the procedure is likely to cause unreasonable pain, then pain relief is required. Leaving this decision in the hands of equine vets is worrying when surveys have found that many equine vets regard castration as causing little pain. And elsewhere in Australia, there are no such caveats. So as a consequence, a significant number of horses continue to be castrated by lay people without anaesthesia or analgesia. And it's very rare for this to be subject to prosecution. So this is one really clear example of what's regarded as acceptable from a legal perspective, falling far short of what we would require to be part of a good life for horses. Another significant issue is the use of aversive devices or gear in racing and equestrian activities. I've used three specific examples here. So severe bits, and indeed many combinations of bit, bridle and martingales. The use of restrictive nosebands, particularly in dressage. So research has shown that repeated use of restricted nosebands is associated not just with aversion, but with deformed nasal bones in horses. And then tongue ties in harness and thoroughbred racing. So the series of photos on the left show a tongue tie being put on a horse. It looks innocuous once it's in place, but it causes pain, distress, and potential tissue damage. And it's estimated that in Australia, over 20% of horses race with tongue ties in place. When researchers start to unpack the use of gear in horse training and in racing, the evidence is that there are many types of gear that can have severe adverse welfare impacts. And it's very hard to see any justification for causing horses pain in the name of sport. The use of one painful device in particular has been a focus for the RSPCA for many years, as it represents a very public form of violence towards horses, and that's the use of whips in racing. It's a great example, though, of changing views on what's acceptable treatment of horses. So whips have been part of racing for so many years, but recent surveys have repeatedly found that 3 in 4 Australians would like to see an end to the use of whips in racing. One of the arguments that's put forward by the industry to defend their use of whips is that they don't cause pain. They just encourage the horse to respond. This is hard to believe when repeated striking with a whip causes visual indentation, as you can see in this image. It's also hard to believe when being hit with a horsewhip is painful to a human. So one way to examine whether the pain we feel when struck with a whip might be whether that might also be felt by horses is to look at the structure of horse and human skin. Last year, a landmark study was published that was supported by RSPCA Australia, which showed that humans and horses have the same density of nerve endings in their skin, demonstrating that the skin has similar structure to detect pain. And on top of other studies which have found that whips don't increase performance or rider safety, this should be enough evidence to ban the use of whips. But so far, only Norway has taken this step. Unsurprisingly, horses are still winning races in Norway. So the benefits of establishing legally enforceable minimum standards that would cover all horses at all ages, in all contexts, and in all Australian jurisdictions are significant. While it's unlikely that minimum standards would reach the level of what's required for a good life, they would provide the opportunity to draw a better line in the sand to mark out what's acceptable, especially if they were science-based and formed around the framework of the 5 domains. They'd also encourage industry standards to be set at a higher level, closer to best practice, and perhaps we might even see an end to the abuse meted out to horses through the use of painful devices. So our next point of call on this journey is traceability. Anecdotally, there might be around 1 million owned horses in Australia at any one time. We're just not sure. We don't know because there's no requirement to register horses or record their breeding, unless you're a participant in a specific industry. Being able to track the ownership and experience of a horse over time via a national traceability register has enormous potential for better welfare outcomes, as well as for biosecurity and emergency disease management. COVID has taught us exactly how important traceability is for that last purpose. And there seems to be strong support for a register in Australia. We've had a Senate inquiry recommend one and a national working group set up to recommend how to deliver one. Yet there's very little concrete action at the moment to translate that into an actual register. In fact, the National Horse Traceability Working Group is still debating whether individual identification via microchips is necessary. So we need to look elsewhere for inspiration on what a national traceability register can offer. In the UK and the EU, microchipping of horses is compulsory. And the UK's Central Equine Database offers both a baseline and an enhanced way of tracking horses throughout their lives, with the potential to record a wide range of information on an individual horse. Imagine how helpful this information would be when transferring a horse from one owner to another. Canada's also well on the way to launching an equine traceability platform with microchips at its centre. It's not just tracking individual horses, but having a better handle on the size of the horse population as a whole would allow breeding to be planned to consider not just the first career a horse might enter, but future careers, and importantly, whether there are likely to be future homes for the number of horses bred. Because at present, just from racing, it's estimated that in Australia, around 8,500 thoroughbreds require rehoming every year. In New Zealand, this number may be as high as 3,000. What happens if there are not enough homes for these horses? So that question brings us to the next stop on this journey, end-of-life decisions for horses. A good life necessarily includes a good death. However, the way in which the lives of many horses end is far from ideal. In 2019, a really shocking expose of the treatment of horses at a Queensland abattoir made this front page issue in Australia. The focus of that program was the slaughter of once highly valued racehorses, but the conditions associated with the transport and killing of horses at knackeries and abattoirs affect all types of horses. The program kick-started a number of actions in addition to the prosecution of individual workers at the abattoir. So in response to the program, the Queensland government commissioned an investigation and a report called the Martin Report. A review of horse transport standards was instigated, and the thoroughbred breeding industry set up its own aftercare welfare working group that I've been sitting on for the last 18 months. I was hoping to be able to talk to you about the recommendations from that working group, but unfortunately that report hasn't been released yet, so that will have to come in time. What the 730 report highlighted was that it's crucial that the racing industry tackles the problem of wastage, but also that the horse world more generally needs affordable, practical and reliable solutions for the humane killing and disposal of horses when the time eventually comes for their life to end. There are 3 different places where we can choose to end a horse's life: on farm, at a knackery or at an abattoir. In Australia, we just have one horse abattoir, the subject of the TV expose. But for a horse to end up there is not only a risk to their welfare, but I think a failure of responsibility, and doesn't align with the concept of a horse as a companion animal. Ideally, a good death for a horse entails a horse being humanely killed on farm in familiar surroundings by an experienced vet. That's not always possible, particularly in a country as big as Australia. Another option is for an experienced and competent knackery operator to use a firearm in the same situation on farm. This option is also increasingly popular because of the environmental issues of dealing with the carcass of a horse that's been killed by lethal injection. But in many parts of Australia, this is also not yet an option, and there's no quality assurance program or horse-specific minimum standards for knackeries. So there's a long way to go still to solve these problems. In the interest of time, I won't go into more detail on this topic, but I'll direct you instead to these 2 really excellent articles in Horses and People magazine, which are freely available online. The first one is by Andrea Harvey, and it examines the issue of horse slaughter in some detail. And the other one by Paul McGreevy steps horse owners through the difficult decision of deciding when it's time to end a horse's life. So I think it's time for me to draw things together. In summary, from what I've talked about so far, if we're able to consider horses as a companion animal rather than a commodity, if we're able to acquire and apply the evidence that's gained from animal welfare and equitation science, if we're able to implement and enforce minimum animal welfare standards that are based on the 5 domains model, and if we can know the size and scope of the horse population and keep track of the life experience of our horses, and if we can plan for a good and timely death, then we'll have a far better chance of ensuring a good life for all horses. But I want to end on a positive note with the idea of giving horse owners and caregivers the ability to assess welfare themselves. So aiming to simplify the complex issue of assessing welfare by providing simple educational 5 domains-based tools that can help horse owners better understand the welfare state of their horse over time. There's 2 such tools in this slide, specifically adapted for horse owners. Don't worry that you can't read the entire text. I just wanted to show you what they look like. But on the left is a horse welfare assessment guide that's designed by Christina Wilkins. In a very recent study of UK horse owner perceptions of horse well-being, Kate Fletcher found that providing owners with this guide helped them to consider the ability of horses to experience positive and negative emotions. And on the right is a simplified version of this guide that's in the form of a checklist, which I've used to help University of Sydney students understand the concept of the 5 domains and conduct their first animal welfare assessments. Applying tools like this over time, as illustrated in this simple chart, can provide an easy way of approaching the complex question of whether an individual horse is experiencing or continuing to experience a good life, and can be especially helpful for monitoring the quality of life for older horses. You can access both those checklists from the Horses and People website. And that's it. So just like to thank everybody who's contributed to the ideas that I've presented here. And there's a list of the main references that I've used.
Thanks so much, Bidda. That was really fascinating. Probably not the thing you think I'm going to pick out of your talk to mention, but I was delighted to see Dunning-Kruger in there. It's another one of my favourite things. It's what I said before in my response to Nayo. The more you know, the more you realise you know so little. So the don't know, you don't know, but gets bigger and bigger as you go through and become more informed, the irony. Dunning-Kruger, I also think, is directly linked and tied to imposter syndrome, because that the further up you get, the less capable you think you are. So there's some interesting things in there. I just wanted to very quickly mention, you talked about the castration situation for horses in New Zealand. We've just recently had care and procedure regulations that have come into play, and Regulation 54 relates to castration of horses or equids, and that stipulates that it must only be a vet or a vet student under direct supervision with pain relief. And that is a directly enforceable regulation, where our codes of welfare, you'll be aware of how this works, but our codes of welfare are not enforceable. They set minimum standards and are used as a guidance tool and a statutory defence. So that additional thing has been put in. So then the way the pain relief works, and I hear what you say about how that works in Australia, I would hazard a guess that it's probably similar here in New Zealand too. You'll get a variety of responses from veterinarians. But yeah, then the type of pain relief that would be used then is determined by the veterinarian themselves, guided by Vet Council, our regulators, as far as what their expectations are around what appropriate pain relief looks like. So that's quite a new process. They only came in 2018. So there's a little bit of bedding in, I suppose, as far as understanding exactly what that looks like from a pain relief perspective going forward. Cool. So we have some good questions here for you as well. And one of these you actually sort of started to talk about a little bit, which was around horses and transfer of ownership from person to person. And the question from Rachel is, how does it mentally affect a horse being shipped from owner to owner over their lifetime? Do they get attached to their owners as, say, a dog would?
Oh, that's a great question. And I mean, as I said at the beginning, I actually don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not an expert on horse behaviour, but what we do know is that horses have quite long memories about their experiences with individuals, and knowing that that those adverse experiences that can happen to them early in their life can have a long impact. So I would imagine, and I really am imagining that any kind of new environment for a prey animal to go into is always going to have some kind of adverse impact, whether or not that's an issue over time. I think a lot of the horse-human bond is about the human experience, and we know very little really about the horse's side of that bond. So that the concern that people have about transfer of ownership is probably more of an emotional response. I think it's probably more important for horses that when they do transfer owners, that they're going to an environment where the experiences that they have are as similar as possible to what they've had before, and those changes are managed in a way that don't suddenly put them into a situation where they don't know what's going on because they haven't been in that situation, or the way in which they're being handled and trained is significantly different.
Yeah, familiarity is important there, isn't it, with the amount of novel stimulus coming at them from a new environment. You could go back and ask your horse expert group about how happy the horses are about this, because they would be very confident in their answer, wouldn't they, around that particular thing. We have another really interesting question here, which is in relation to euthanasia. So when recommending euthanasia on a farm, would you stipulate that this be taken away from the observation of other horses?
Yes. I mean, we don't, again, it's an area that we still don't really know that much about. Not just, but it's clear that it isn't just visual contact with other horses that matters. It's the smell. It's how close that might take place to other horses. So that we do know that there's a whole the potential there for horses to and many species to actually be aware of any stress that's going on. Now, hopefully, if you're euthanizing a horse on an individual basis in the best possible way, then there won't be overt signs of stress from that horse because they'll be unaware of what's going to happen to them. But yes, I mean, a quiet place, quite familiar place away from other horses is the best situation.
Yeah. As a practicing veterinarian, I can always remember going into euthanize horses, always had this, it's such a stressful thing to do, sedate and put a catheter in and do everything right, but they're big animals, and you just always have this, okay, I've done everything right, and every now and then, you still have unexpected outcomes, and that, it's very stressful for everybody who's involved, and distressing for other reasons too, of course. Okay, I do see a few more questions there. I think just again, in the interest of time, we will move on. And those questions, Fiona, if I get a nod from you, we can address those after the fact. And cool. Great, thank you. That was wonderful. Thanks very much, Bidda. Really, really interesting talk to listen to. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.